Welcome to the Total Boss Podcast, and I'm your host, Christiano Green, a podcast where we talk about finding fulfillment through self-development, being a leader of your own life, and getting the most out of it as well. Tenacity, originality, talent, authenticity, and being legendary. It's all about living your best life. Hello, all you total bosses out there, and welcome to another episode of the Total Boss Podcast. I am your host, Christiano Green, and I'm a gay men's relationship coach, helping gay men to find long-lasting love. So this week on the podcast, I really wanted to jump in and talk about, something that I get asked about a lot, whether, people are part of this community or whether they are not. Some people just don't truly understand what does, LGBTQIA plus actually stand for. So I thought I'd jump on and share a bit about it all so that, it can get cleared up as much as possible. And obviously, if anyone has any additional comments or questions, you can ask from here. So really, LGBT and LGBTQIA plus are kind of acronyms that are used to, describe the community of people who really just don't identify as heterosexual or straight or cisgender. And really it takes into account both sexual identity as well as gender identity. Now, as the world gains a better understandings of, people's different sexual orientations and gender identities, the words and letters that we use to describe people in this community will continue to evolve. So if you're listening to this, 3 months, 6 months, a year or 2 years down the track, and there's something missing from this, please know that this is the best information that I have at hand. And there's always going to be evolving things that come into this as well. It's really important that using appropriate terminology and naming is important, especially when we're ensuring accurate and inclusive representation of, different people's diverse identities, right? Now, it's like I said, it's really here to describe people's sexual or gender identity. Now, sexual orientation refers to, a person's physical, emotional, and romantic attraction to another person. So, this is being straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual. And when we talk about gender identity, this describes a person's internal sense of being female, male, or someone outside of that gender binary. So it's really important to note that gender identity is not determined by one's sex that is assigned at birth, and that sex and gender are exactly different, right? They're not the same. And like I said, as we become more inclusive, these will evolve and change and differ as we find out more about people and our backgrounds, right? So where did, the original LGBT kind of come from? The language really used to describe people that were LGBT, during the 1950s and 60s, really kind of probably stood down to people classing everyone as part of the gay community, right? And it was really only when we started to have, monumental movements and advancements within our community, which happened, really in the late 60s, early 70s, is when we started to really pivot and shift the names away from just gay rights movements to LGBT movements. So really, most people understand that L stands for lesbian. The term lesbian really is describing a woman who is physically, emotionally, or romantically attracted to other women. And they say lesbian because they're only usually attracted to people of the same sex there when it comes to being a lesbian, women attracted to women. Now, G stands for gay. So this is for a person who is physically, emotionally, or romantically attracted to people within the same gender. That's the overarching term. But when we take it down a notch, it's really men who are attracted to men and only men, whether that's physically, emotionally, or romantically. Now, when we move into, the B, which is for bisexual, this is the term that describes a person who is physically, emotionally, or romantically attracted to people within more than one sex, gender, or gender identity. So usually it's a man who's attracted to both men and women, or women attracted to both men and women as well. Now, when we move into the T, this stands for transgender. And the term transgender describes a person whose gender identity or expression is different than their sex assigned at birth. So transgender should be used as an adjective, not as a noun or a verb. So basically, transgendered men would be usually someone who is a woman at birth who's moved into transitioning into a man because they don't fit into that assigned body. And a transgendered woman would be the opposite, someone who was born physically as a man but don't necessarily define themselves as that, whether that is spiritually, emotionally, physically, on a number of different levels, because there are different levels that people can go through that class themselves into those different categories as well. So when we get there, as it evolved, as we talked about, things change and things add to it, right? So when we look into it, Q was added initially next. And really what that meant is Q stands for queer. Now, this is used by some people whose sexual orientation is not exclusively heterosexual or straight, and it's also an umbrella term that includes people who have non-binary or gender fluid identities. So really, what does that mean? Non-binary describes a person whose gender identity falls outside of strictly male or strictly female. Gender fluid describes a person whose gender identity or expression changes over time. Genderqueer describes a person who does not follow static categories of gender, embracing a fluidity of gender identity and oftentimes sexual orientations. And then we've got gender non-conforming, which describes a person who does not abide by traditional or cultural expectations in regards to appearance or behavior of their gender. Now, it's important to note that over 12% of LGBTQ youth identified as non-binary and 9% identified as genderqueer or gender non-conforming. So that's the main arch of the Q. There's a second kind of Q that's in there, which also stands for questioning. And so when Q comes at the end of LGBTQ, it can also mean questioning for some people. And questioning really is a term used to describe a person who really is exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity. So they're not going to define themselves, they're questioning, they're getting curious about what they stand for and who they are outside of their sexuality and gender, and trying to come to terms with that as well. So again, those are the basis of them. But then, like I said, we've added in so many more as we've got to understand more sexualities and more genders. And you can look at some of the more common ones that you'll see, which, when we get to LGBTQIA+, you've got the I, which really stands for intersex. And this is a term used to describe a person who is born with differences in their sex traits or reproductive anatomy that don't fit typical definitions of female or male. So there may be differences in regards to their, genitalia, the chromosomes, the hormones, internal sex organs, or even their, different sex characteristics such as the pubic hair, breasts, facial hair. So people in those circumstances will fall into being intersex as well. Now, when we move to the A, this stands for asexual, which is a term used to describe a person who lacks sexual attraction or desire for other people. Now, it's different from celibacy, in which people make a choice to abstain from sexual activity. So asexual really just don't have any sexual desire or sexual attraction for other people altogether. That's kind of the broad thing of it. There's a spectrum of all of these things as well. So there's levels of it as well that you can go into so much more detail as well. Now, the plus stands for plus, and this is a symbol that represents members of the community who identify with a sexual orientation or gender identity that isn't included within that LGBTQIA plus acronym, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, intersex, or asexual. And it's an inclusive way of representing gender and sexual identities that letters and words cannot yet fully describe. Right? And as we've talked about this over the years, as people, explore themselves more, we will grow the differences that come within, the LGBTQIA plus, right? And we've already come further forward because, you can really go through and talk a lot about some of the other ones. So, for example, there is to S, which stands for two-spirit, which is a term that traditionally originated from, Native American culture that describes people who are male, female, or intersex and have both a male and female spirit within them. It's sometimes referred to as a third gender. So that's one that's been evolved and understood as we understand more cultures, right, throughout the world. There's also things such as P, which will stand for pansexual, which is a term that describes a person who may have a physical, emotional, or romantic attraction to people of any gender. So they may not experience these feelings at the same time or in the same way or level. Now, there's another A there that will stand for ally, which, people try to think, they get used to understanding this differently from the asexual, but the ally is actually a term that describes a person who actively supports the LGBTQIA plus community. It includes people who are straight or cisgender, a term used to describe a person whose gender identity aligns with their sex assigned at birth, and those within the LGBT community. So if you're people who are heterosexual or straight, or cisgender, meaning that their gender is aligned to their sex that they have as well. So really, as we go down it, these are the main things that you'll get that people will find. But like I said, as you evolve, there is a number of different things there that you can include. You can talk about things such as people who are polyamorous, which means that people believe in loving more than one person at a time. This relates to things outside of necessarily being, gender or sexuality specific, because people in that might be, like I said, pansexual, but polyamorous, meaning they'll date multiple people from that could be all of the same sex, right? Like a man dating multiple women, they believe they're polyamorous, or it could be multiple genders, which means could be bisexual or pansexual as well. But the polyamorous means people who get into relationships, whether that's physical, emotional, or romantic relationships, attraction to multiple people. So that's kind of where we go to in that. And it isn't necessarily an overarching thing, but it is part of that because it is a community of people that view love and sexuality in a different way as well. So I hope that kind of answers some of those questions for you when it comes to where we're at on the spectrum of all of these things. Remember, all of these are a spectrum, and every single person gets the ability to define their sexual identity or their gender identity. So it's never about trying to prove someone right or wrong about who they love or what their gender is. It's about allowing people to explore that for themselves. And like I said, as we evolve, we'll realize that these things will also evolve because that's just human nature, and that's just, then the world that we live in. But like I said, it's important for us to realize that, as we get better understanding of these the words will evolve. And it's important for us to understand the terminology, and naming is really important because it's ensuring accurate and inclusive representation of people's diverse identities. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments, your questions on this topic as always. So feel free to, comment below or send me a message on social media because like I said, I'd love to hear from you on this topic. You might have something that I've not addressed. I'd love to hear from you, your perspective on it as well. I'll be back next week with another episode. Other than that, always remember that you've got this and I've got you. Bye for now.